for having Certus here in the talk lineup today. Let me just pull my slides up real quick. All right, so because the sort of product lineup that we carry at Certus is so broad, and I know there's sort of a diverse audience here today, what I've opted to do with this talk slot is to essentially give an overview for you all of sort of what biopesticides are and where they might be useful to consider incorporating into your insect and disease management program if you're not already using them. I know a handful of our products are sold through Green Earth, so if you're a customer of theirs, you may already have experience with a few, but this will also introduce some new ones and just sort of give some guidance on how to think about using them if you don't have experience with them already. So biopesticides are a pretty broad category of pest management tools. So they can be things that have a living agent, so a microorganism that is the active ingredient, but they can also be um, like peptides or other sort of compounds produced by plants. As long as it's from some sort of naturally occurring substance, then it gets grouped into this category. And a lot of them are allowed in organic production. I would say the majority of these do tend to be allowed in organic production. So if you're an organic producer, you probably have experience with them, but there's a lot of benefits to incorporating them into conventional production as well. And so this is just sort of covering the broad category of types of things that fall under this umbrella. And we carry a number of things that fall into each of these. So some are going to have bacteria as an active ingredient, and this can include biofungicides, especially in the Bacillus genus of bacteria, or it can be in the BT bioinsecticide category against caterpillars. There are a number of them that include fungi as an active ingredient, or even sort of biochemicals and other plant-derived compounds. So quite a variety of different products and tools that fall under this great big umbrella. So if you're an organic producer, then the fact that they're allowed in production is already sort of an obvious why use them, because tools tend to be more limited in that space. But if you're a conventional grower, you might be wondering why you would want to consider using them. What are sort of the benefits? Why would it be useful to add into a management program? And a lot of the use of ours does tend to be in conventional production. I would say the majority of our use ends up being in conventional production because they can be really good tools to integrate with traditional chemistry to get sort of better longevity out of conventional products or to alleviate other production concerns that might come up with traditional chemistry. So one of the benefits can be that biopesticides tend to be exempt from maximum residue limits. So depending on what kind of crop you're producing and where you're selling it for anything that involves exports, or depending on the market that you're selling into, if there are consumer expectations about residue, having products with lower residue limits can be really helpful there. They offer greater flexibility around production handling and harvest management. They tend to have shorter pre-harvest intervals and shorter re-entry intervals after application, so it can give producers the chance to get back into the field sooner after application. When they're rotated with conventional chemistries, they can be helpful for delaying the development of pesticide resistance. So when products stop working as effectively as they used to because of exposure to the same active ingredient over time, this can be a good tool to help extend the life of some of those conventional tools by adding essentially more tools into the toolbox and helping delay that resistance development. They can help improve worker safety because they tend to have lower mammalian toxicity. They tend to be less toxic to workers. They can help preserve beneficial insects, including pollinators. So if you're growing something that relies on pollinators, or if you're relying on predators and other sort of natural enemies to help with pest control, having chemistries that are softer on those can be helpful because you don't lose those tools as you're adding in chemical tools to your management. I already sort of mentioned consumer perception in the residue limit category, but again, they can help with food safety and just sort of consumer perception if consumers are concerned about residue on crops. So if you've never worked with them before, you might be sort of wondering like what you would have to be concerned about efficacy wise. What's different about them? How do you make sure you're using them in an effective way? So with any chemical tool, no matter what the category, we always recommend following the label for storage and use rates. If you don't use something according to instructions, you're probably already setting yourself up for failure. So that's always a good place to start, is to make sure you're storing them the way that's recommended, so that if, especially if it's something that's having a living active ingredient like a bacteria or a fungi, you don't want to kill off your tool before it ever gets the chance to get used in the field. So always follow storage recommendations. And then also follow use rates, because unlike conventional tools, there are some cases where more is not always better in how biopesticides work. So paying attention to what rate is recommended for the problem that you're facing can be really helpful to make sure it works effectively. Um, because they sometimes have shorter shelf life than other conventional tools, we don't recommend buying way more than you need. Start with the amount that you think you need, so that way you can use it up within its shelf life. A lot of these are preventative tools, so you want to be proactive with timing and get them put out, especially with fungicides, put out before disease has really set in, if they're working preventatively. And then with insecticides, you often want to get them out while populations are still at a manageable level, because they may not keep up with an outbreaking population of pests. Be realistic with how long a residual is going to last, because some can have a couple weeks of efficacy, others are not going to last quite that long. So if something only lasts a few days and you've got pests continuously moving into the system, you want to make sure you're getting back out there and keeping up with that, and not expecting to get much longer out of it than is realistic to expect out of it. And then also be cautious with tank mixes, which I'll talk about more as I go through the rest of this. So we sell quite a few different biofungicides in the Northeast, and so there's a number of different ways that these work that I'll walk through, just so you sort of can be thinking about how that relates to timing and where they're going to be most effective in a management program. So the first category are what we call plant activators. This sometimes gets abbreviated to SAR when it comes to different products that are in this category. And Lifeguard would be one example of this, where the active ingredient is a bacillus bacteria. But there's a number of other products in the market, both organic and conventional, that have this same mode of action. And so what these are doing is essentially elevating the natural defenses in plants to help prevent disease infection. So plants have natural defenses that they can mount against a pathogen infection. That could be systemic acquired resistance, which is where the SAR nickname for these come in, or there are other sort of pathways that can get activated when infection moves in the roots, or even against herbivores as well. But I'm focusing more on the disease exposure in this one. And so when you use an SAR fungicide, what this is doing is essentially giving a plant a cue ahead of time that a threat might be coming, so it can get those defenses ready earlier and be already ready to go when a disease moves in. So what would normally happen is a pathogen infection happens. After the plant realizes that, it gets these defenses going. What we're trying to do with an SAR tool is sort of give it a priming stimulus ahead of time. So giving it a clue that something is happening, so it can start getting defenses ready, and they happen sooner and do a better job at preventing infection from setting in. So this is a product that can be kept, if it's kept dry and stored well, can last up to 2 years. It's pretty tank mix compatible across the board, but we typically want to avoid mixing with antibiotics or things like oxidate, just because those do kill bacteria in the tank. So, other than things that directly kill bacteria, it's usually pretty compatible with other things you'd be tank mixing. And it's something that does kick in fairly quick. So, after application, it only takes about 3 hours to get that sort of priming process going, which makes it fairly rain fast, which is nice, can make it a little easier to incorporate into a program. And the defense response is mounted completely about 24 hours after application. Because it's relying on natural defenses of plants, this response does tend to be stronger in plants that have more tendency to mount those responses. So in um, fruit or vegetable crops, we might see differences in different cultivars. If there are cultivars that are more prone to having a defense response, we're going to see a stronger impact of using these in those crops than something that doesn't have a lot of its own capability to mount responses. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're growing something with different cultivar options. As with any preventative tool, you want to get this going before infection is suspected because it is a preventative way of dealing with diseases. It's not going to come in and take care of it after the disease is going. And the response lasts about 2 weeks, or even a little bit longer at times. So it's one that's sort of in a rare category of having a pretty decently long residual for biofungicides, which is nice. There's a number of other bacterial-based biofungicides on the market, and this is sort of a more crowded category of them, where they have multiple modes of action that they're pulling together. So this includes things like double nickel, thea, or howler. All of these are relying on bacteria that do a whole group of different things to contribute to disease control. So one of the things that they could be doing is producing lipopeptides that have antimicrobial activity. So they might be killing off bacteria or fungal diseases on contact. They can produce other substances like enzymes or siderophores that damage cell walls of fungal diseases or make it harder for fungal diseases to take up nutrients. So there's a bunch of different routes to essentially attacking diseases with these. Some are going to help colonize plant roots if they're applied as a soil application. They're going to be able to colonize plant roots, or if they're put out as a foliar spray, they might be colonizing flowers and preventing diseases from moving into the flower. So, for example, fire blight in apple is a bacterial disease that moves in through the flowers of apples. So having that flower space already colonized prevents it from being able to get in to that route of exposure. So, sort of out competing the space where pathogens are moving in is another mode of action here. They can also do a little bit of stimulating plant defenses, similar to how the SARs would. And they can also help promote just sort of healthy plant growth and contribute to better yield that way. So all of the products in this category are going to be doing a whole group of these different things, but which ones they emphasize might differ. So that's why it's such a crowded category, is because they're each sort of doing something slightly differently within this whole like multi-mode of action toolbox. So this is showing an example of that like protective growth along plant roots. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing the roots themselves. On the right-hand side, you're going to see that they look quite a bit thicker because they have this protective barrier that the bacteria have put there by growing along the root surface that makes it harder for pathogens to move into those roots. So this is showing sort of how those metabolites and peptides are preventing disease control. Um, and there are a bunch of different categories of these. So different bacterial species, so like double nickel versus thea versus howler, for example, are all going to differ a little bit in what proportion of these that they are producing, which then gives them efficacy or stronger efficacy against certain diseases over others. So that's another reason why there's so many to choose from, and um, which one gets recommended might depend on which disease you're having the most trouble with, whether it's bacterial diseases or fungal diseases. So I mentioned earlier this systemic acquired resistance that's up top, where it's um, stimulating the pathway that would be protecting against plant defenses through salicylic acid production. For some of these that are labeled for both foliar or in furrow application, you're going to get an SAR response if you put it out as foliar, and you're going to get a different response if you put it out in furrow. And that's just because you're putting it out in a different place and triggering a different part of the plant's defense pathway. So you're going to get more of a induced resistance if you're triggering it through the roots. So both of these can be useful for disease production, but or disease protection, but just highlighting that they can work differently depending on where you're applying them to a crop and what diseases you're going after with that application. So similarly to Lifeguard, if it's stored correctly, any of these should get about 2 years of shelf life in storage. You still don't want to be tank mixing with things that actively kill bacteria in the jug. Um, and in this case, so I'll highlight this later when I'm talking about things with fungi as an active ingredient. But this is one where we also want to recommend against tank mixing with other products where the active ingredient is a fungus, just because since these do have fungicidal activity, you don't want to be killing off the other product that you're adding into the tank. So that would just be something to keep in mind, tank mix compatibility wise, is basically you just want to avoid mixing things that are going to actively kill each other off, because you want them both to work if you're putting both of them out. That's always a good rule of thumb. But other than that, they're generally pretty compatible with anything else that you'd be putting in the tank. So there are also a number of biofungicides that are not alive. And so here you start to move away from some of those like antibiotic or fungal tank mix concerns, because there isn't anything in the tank to kill off. So one example of this would be something like OSO. So the active ingredient here is a polyoxin D zinc salt, which is it's a metabolite that's produced by bacterial fermentation, and this metabolite then prevents fungi from being able to produce the chitin in their cell walls. So they're not able to grow and germinate that way. And so that tends to have pretty good contact efficacy for a lot of fungal diseases. That tends to be where we position this one. So it's pretty commonly used in some vegetable crops, small fruit crops, or tree fruit crops where we have either fruit rots, or there's a number of foliar diseases in vegetable crops where we're able to go after the disease on the leaf surface by having contact through this that then breaks up those cell wall growth. So similarly, like you still wouldn't want to tank mix it with things that have fungi in the tank, but otherwise, you're not going to run into any compatibility concerns that would reduce this product's efficacy. Because it's a contact product, with any product, having good coverage is always important, but with something that's working as a contact product, it becomes even more important, because if it's not coming in contact with your target, you're not going to get efficacy out of it. So, um, depending on what plant you're applying to, always make sure you're applying enough water to get good coverage of that plant structure. And similarly to most other biofungicides, it's always a good idea to store in a cool, dry place to make sure you get good efficacy out of it over time. So another product, and I believe this is one that Green Earth carries, so it's something some of you may have had experience with, is Quava, and this is a type of copper. but it's a copper octanoate, which is a copper soap, um, which is a little different than many other coppers on the market. So if you're unfamiliar with copper, which I'd be surprised just because it has been used as a fungicide since the 1700s. But in small doses, it's an essential micronutrient for all living organisms. But when we put it out at a higher concentration, it can be a broad spectrum tool against bacterial or fungal diseases. And so, as it's adhering to a leaf surface, it sort of provides this protective barrier on the foliage. When it comes in contact with water, it releases copper ions that then have efficacy against diseases. And different copper fungicides can vary in how many copper ions that they release. And those copper ions are going to do a whole bunch of things to damage parts of bacterial or fungal cells. So they might be damaging the DNA, which causes cell death, whether it's a bacteria or a fungi. They can damage proteins within the disease cells, and also disrupt the integrity of cell membranes. So they do a whole bunch of different things to diseases to kill them off and manage diseases. So with any sort of copper product, whether it's a copper soap or another fixed copper, there's a lot of different attributes to consider when you're choosing one, such as the speed and strength that they provide disease control at, how well they're going to release copper ions, how long of a residual you get out of them, how versatile is the formulation for your production system, as well as sort of crop safety concerns. And so on that last note, something that makes Quava a really interesting copper product to work with, or makes it so special, is it is what's considered a low load copper. So whereas a lot of copper fungicides on the market have up closer to 30% metallic copper, Quava, this copper soap only has 1.8%. So it's a much lower percentage of copper, and it's getting efficacy both from the copper itself as well as that sort of oil soluble tail that makes it into a copper soap. And so this allows it to have a much shorter REI than most other coppers. So it can be as short as 4 hours that you can get back into a field after it's been applied. Whereas a lot of other coppers on the market, you have to wait 48 hours before you can get back in. It has, because it's such a low percentage of copper, it doesn't have as strong of a copper smell or visible blue color. So for a lot of ag producers, that can be really appealing if they're applying it to fresh fruit and vegetables, that they don't have to worry about having this visible blue color on their plants after they're harvesting it. Unlike other coppers, it does have efficacy against powdery mildew because of that oil soluble tail. Whereas copper doesn't typically have a lot of efficacy on that particular plant pathogen that's common on many of the crops that we grow. And that oil soluble tail also sort of helps it work as though it already has a surfactant built in, which can help get really good coverage out of this product compared to other copper products on the market. As well as having less of a phytotoxicity risk because it's that low percentage of copper. So, oops, clicked on the wrong thing. Sorry about that. So, the way that this is working, because it's in a different formulation than a lot of other coppers, is instead of just spreading across the leaf surface, Quavo will also sort of help get better entrance into the pathogen cells, and help break down those cell walls when it comes in contact with them. It has really small particle sizes, which can help get really good coverage across the leaf surface. So this is showing an example of that particle size relative to a couple of other copper products on the market. And a question I get from growers all the time when they're first getting introduced to it is how can it be effective with such a low percentage of copper? That tends to be confusing because we'll talk about that release of copper ions and how to compare different copper products. And then we talk about this one and it tends to catch people off guard because it's such a low percentage. And so essentially what it's doing is because it has such small particles, all of the copper ions are more available to the surface area and able to get released more easily in contact with water. The small particles also tend to be more rain fast than larger particles are because the larger particles are more susceptible to getting dislodged from the plant surface. So the next group of products I'm going to talk about, some of these are insecticides, and then we also have a group of products we sell that do a mix of fungicide and insecticide activity. So I've grouped those in with the insecticides, but Sil Matrix is one that I believe Green Earth also sells this product. So this is a potassium silicate product. And so what this does is when it dries on the leaf surface after application, it's essentially creating a physical barrier on the surface of the leaf through that silica that's being deposited. So this can help strengthen leaf surfaces and make it more resistant to attacks from diseases and from insect and mite pests. It also restricts fungal disease development. It makes it harder for fungal diseases to penetrate into the leaf surface. It also tends to make foliage less palatable to insects. But when it comes in contact with insects and mites on the surface and with fungal diseases, it also works as a desiccant. So it's essentially drying those pathogens and pests out, so killing them off that way. And there's also some data to show that it can decrease plant quality for insects that manage to survive that desiccation and still penetrate the leaf surface. There's going to be lower quality of plant sap and reduce insect development over time. So a lot of different ways that this is sort of helping protect against plant diseases and insect pests. This is one, so again, because it doesn't have a living active ingredient, it tends to be very compatible with a broad range of other pesticides. Because it's having to coat the leaf surface and come in contact with diseases and pests, we do want to make sure we're putting it out with enough water to get really good coverage. With anything, it's always good to store in a cool, dry place. And then this is one, just because it is sort of nutrient based, you do want to keep an eye on the pH of your tank mixture because the potassium silicate will solidify out if you're between like around pH of 6. So that would be something to just keep in mind if this is something you're using and you've ever had issues with it solidifying in the tank, this may have been the cause and would be something to keep an eye on. Or if you're new to using it, just something to keep an eye on is to know what your water pH is, what your tank mix pH is, if you're mixing it with other products. Just sort of avoid that danger zone there. Save yourself some trouble. The next product to talk about is Trilogy, and I believe this is another one that Green Earth carries. But this one is a neem oil. So neem is a plant, a tree, and this oil is extracted out of the seeds that are produced on that tree. And they can suffocate pests on contact. They can desiccate it. So similar to how Sil Matrix is going to dry out the surface of insects and mites, this is also going to do that by sort of breaking down the protective waxy cuticle that insects have. It's going to agitate pests like thrips and sort of repel them from feeding. They don't like coming in contact with this, which because you're agitating them, it can also help increase efficacy of other insecticides you might be using in your program because it's going to increase their exposure. Because it has a fairly strong smell, it also can help interfere with host recognition. So when insect pests are trying to find host plants, if the plant smells differently, they're going to have a harder time locating that food source or habitat and interfere with their ability to recognize it as a place that they want to be. And for pests like aphids, it can also interfere with their ability to um, penetrate the leaf surface with their stylet mouth parts. For insects that are laying eggs, it's also going to interfere with the adhesion of eggs to plant surfaces. So it's doing a whole bunch of different things to help control insects and mites when it's applied. For insects, it tends to be most effective against small, soft-bodied things, so aphids, thrips, mealybugs. It's also got some efficacy on spider mites and broad mites. And its shelf life is about a year as long as it's stored um, at ambient temperature. It also has efficacy on fungal diseases in addition to insects and mites. So if it's sprayed before disease infection, it's going to help shield plant surfaces and prevent fungal spores from germinating once they land on the leaf surface. Um, when they do land, it can coat and suffocate them. It can also desiccate the spores and make it harder for them to survive and grow. And if it's applied early in infection, it can have some curative activity in addition to preventative activity. So this is sort of showing that like timeline of depending on when you're applying it relative to when infection is happening, it can be preventative or curative by sort of preventing the spores from landing and germinating or preventing them from growing and then desiccating them once they're on the leaf surface. So going into more detail on how it works against mites and insects. So it can coat insects and mites directly, which suffocates them. It also is going to, again, break down that waxy cuticle of the insects and mites. So it's damaging their sort of protection on their body, which then dehydrates them. And on the plant, so that's what it's doing to the insect or mite itself. On the plant, it's doing a number of things, like I said earlier, of sort of making it harder for them to find their hosts, making it harder for them to feed on that leaf surface, and making it harder for them to lay eggs and having those eggs stay attached to the leaf. And it produces a whole bunch of different compounds that all sort of contribute to that smell and why it's interfering with host plant recognition. And this is something that can't be controlled, like which of these compounds show up in the end product can't be controlled in the extraction or formulation process. It comes from the source itself, and so choosing a product that's coming from a good quality seed source is going to be the best way to make sure you're getting a good amount of these in your neem oil product that you're using. So the last product to cover, this one is a fungal-based insecticide, and in the ornamentals market, it goes by the name Botanigard. In the ag market, we talk about it as Botega. They're the same active ingredient, so I'll talk about it as an ingredient, but it comes in a number of different formulation options. So there are dry, wettable powders, or there's oil dispersion liquid products. So you have options depending on what formulation is easier to use. If stored at room temperature, it can last at least a year or even a year and a half, depending on the formulation. And has a pretty broad number of crops, both indoor and outdoor, that it's labeled for. And so this is a Bovaria bassiana fungus, strain GHA, which is the strain on the market that's sort of leading in terms of the broad spectrum of activity it has for different pests, stability and its shelf life. It's got the highest spore count of any Bovaria on the market. It has a 4-hour REI, so when you're looking at insecticidal tools, again, it can be really helpful to be able to get back in shortly after applying instead of having to wait 12 to 24 hours to get back in after a conventional insecticide. So if you're growing anything where being able to have access to that plant is helpful, looking at products that have these short shelf lives can be really helpful for your production flexibility there. So the way that this works is by attaching to insect surfaces. The spores will germinate and grow into the insect body and kill it off. That takes about 5 days. And then once that is done, basically the job is done. So if conditions are really good for fungal growth, you may see the second half of this cycle where you actually see mycosis and see the fungus continue to reproduce and come back out of the insect and produce spores. But oftentimes in production, we don't see this half, and that's okay. You don't have to see fungal growth to know that it has worked inside of the insect. You still, at this halfway point, you still end up with dead insects and no more feeding from them, which is good. But just a common misconception I like to clear up when we can is just because you're not seeing fungal growth on the outside of an insect doesn't mean that it didn't kill the pest off effectively. So depending, this is one I mentioned earlier that you always want to read the pesticide label when you're using products, but this is one where depending on the pest, the rate does change, whereas a lot of those fungicide examples I showed have a pretty standard rate no matter what crop or pest you're working with. Here's one where you end up having sort of differences in rate depending on the application method or the pest that you're targeting. And so make sure to consult the label, but you can use it both indoor and outdoor as a foliar product. And then it also is labeled for dipping cuttings and whether unrooted or rooted. So that can be another option if you need that method of application for pests you're targeting. With the dry product, the liquid product is labeled for foliar use, but again, both indoor and outdoor. Uh, Again, just to reinforce, so this has a pretty high spore count, so we get good efficacy by having a good amount of active ingredient in the market. So best practices when using this, to always scout and start applications early in the pest cycle. Once a pest population has outbroken, it's going to be really hard to keep up with, especially with a product that can take 3, 4, 5 days to kill the pest off. You want to spray enough to get good coverage, but not enough for it to run off, because then you'll be losing your spores off into the environment in that runoff. If you have really high pest populations, you may want to shorten the interval of application to make sure you're keeping up with them and keeping the residual active long enough. Um, yeah, so I was supposed to be co-presenting today. So these are the slides that my co-presenter had put together, and he's out sick today. So apologies for the slower presentation on this section. But again, if you're using the dry, you have a broader array of options since it is labeled for that dip use. So if you're looking to drench a crop or be able to do that pre-plant dip, you're going to want to choose the dry formulation. If you're doing a foliar spray, then you have both formulation options to choose from. You definitely want to make sure you're agitating your tank mixture. This is one that you want to help keep the spores suspended in solution. So it does mix up nicely, but you want to make sure you're keeping that mixture agitated so the spores stay distributed through the solution as you're spraying it out. And it is pretty broadly compatible with other insecticides. So I mentioned earlier that with fungicides, you don't necessarily want to be tank mixing it with fungicides, including softer ones. So whether it's a conventional fungicide or a biofungicide, you don't want to be mixing them with a product like this because you'll kill the spores before they get the chance to do their job. But for insecticides, we don't run into that same concern. So there is a lot of tank mix options that you can consider. Compatibility isn't a concern there. If you are using fungicides, you can still use them both in a production system. You just want to split the application up by a few days to make sure this can do its job and not be exposed to the fungicide right after application. You also want to avoid fungicides that contain sulfur, because those will kill the spores as well. And then anything that's like a mineral oil formulation is going to smother the spores. So you don't want to tank mix with that either. But otherwise, no compatibility concerns. So I mentioned earlier, it's important to always follow the recommended rates. Be proactive with timing, since so many of these are either preventative products or, in the case of insecticides, they're going to be more effective when the population is small and manageable than when it's totally out of control and outbreaking. So be proactive with keeping an eye on things, getting things applied sooner rather than later. And again, be cautious with tank mixes. But when you're thinking about how to build these into a program, you have options. So I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of benefit to using these to help delay resistance management, get more tools in your toolbox. And so this is one example of doing that where we see decent control of powdery mildew in this case. This is on grapes, just as an example. But we looking at OSO double nickel or lifeguard, we do get pretty good control just using them, but we get even better control if we're rotating it with other products. So if you're a conventional grower who's already got conventional tools you're happy with, you can still get really good efficacy by rotating these in for some of your applications. So if you're looking at not having enough applications in a season for a particular active ingredient, or you're worried about resistance, or you're worried about residue, this is just showing an example that you can add biofungicides into the mix and still get season-long efficacy by rotating them in. And you can also consider tank mixing them just to get a longer, better efficacy on really hard to control pests and diseases. So I think I might have gone a little short on time, but hopefully that's all right. So if you do, I'll be around for the Q&A session at the end. And if you have further questions, my email address is there. I typically work in the ag space, not the landscape and ornamental space. But Lee Shaber, whose contact info is up on the slide as well, is the person at Certus that handles those cropping systems. So he couldn't join us today because he has the flu, but there's his contact info if you do have questions about those markets, since I didn't cover them as much as the ag side of things.
So thank you, Carly. That was great. And yeah, like Carly said, she works more on the ag side, but a lot of these products do switch over. Like the Quava is great for any soil-borne diseases and turf as well. We do work with the Sil Matrix, and that's a great product. That's hopefully going to catch on a little bit more in the future. And you guys have Home Plate, which we sell a ton of, which is an outstanding weed killer. We use that a lot in vineyards and stuff, and a lot of the landscapers do or turf care people do landscape as well. So the Home Plate, and also on the turf side, it's called Final Sand. They're very similar. They're fatty acids. you can use that around trees. You could use it in vineyards, like around vines, hop growers. We sell a lot to those in those arenas, and really good weed killers. So does anybody, let me check the Q&A, have questions for Carly? And we do have ag and indoor growers here. So I'm going to check. Well, actually, that's a good question. R asked if these products are labeled for turf. A lot of like, is the Quava and Matrix, do they have a turf on the label as well?
Good question. I don't typically work with turf, but I can
Yeah.
double check and get an answer after this. I can double check those labels and find
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, that was our, I believe some of them do. The exception would be home plate that they kind of try to keep in the ag arena, in which case we use final sand in the turf arena. So home plate tends to be a little bit more concentrated and you can use lower rates. And some people do go back and forth with that. But in general, we use home plate in the ag arena and final sand, very similar would be in the turf arena. Carly, Art also had the question, is the pH of the water important to these products?
Can be. So Sil Matrix is the one that I mentioned has like a pretty specific sort of middle pH that it doesn't like, which is a little unusual that it's like the middle area is what you want to avoid, but you want to stay away from like 6. So we tend to tell people to either stay below 5.5 or above 6.5 for Sil Matrix, just to stay away from that area where it precipitates out. With most of the others, they're going to be a lot more flexible, anywhere that's like neutral or close to neutral, but a lot of them tend to be less effective if you start getting above like 8. If you start getting into really high pH, they're not going to be as happy. The bacteria or fungi in those will be not thriving at those higher pHs.
Yeah, and most waters are going to be in that neutral sort of range, especially if you're using city water. I wouldn't worry about it. It'd have to be an extreme case that you'd have problems with that. Umar asked, is the neem oil compound effective on vegetable crops? So,
Is. So it is labeled for the majority of vegetable crops that we grow here in the US, and it's going to be most effective on those small soft-bodied insects, so aphids, thrips, whiteflies, spider mites, things like that. And it's going to be good against some fungal diseases like powdery mildew. So any of the pests and diseases it's labeled on in vegetables, it does fairly well on.
okay. Somebody asked, can the silicate be coupled with kale and clay?
I think can, as long as the pH doesn't get into a questionable range with that, which I don't know what the clay pH is off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't be an issue with like the product itself clogging up. We just get careful with tank mixes if you start to get too close to that 6
Yeah.
pH.
I think, we sell a ton of the surround kale and clay. That's an amazing product. I can say, anecdotally, I don't know people mixing it, but I wouldn't foresee a big problem. I don't think the kale and clay is going to really change the pH. It's, basically clay, which is probably very close to neutral. So I wouldn't see a problem, and I could see where you'd have additive effects there. So the Sil Matrix certainly will institute, some of the SAR natural defenses and coat, and the kale and clay is a great insecticide as well. Kale and clay, for those that aren't familiar, you spray it on plants. We use it a ton in fruit grow, like apple trees and stuff. And it coats the leaves. It's a good sun protectant from burning, but insects can't recognize that as a plant. It like sort of hides whatever they can detect with their eyes or their smell. And it's very effective. We sell tractor trailer loads of this stuff every year, so it's a great product. And I could see where with the silicate it'd be additive as well to help coat the surface and protect it. So the
I
other,
also like when it lands on insects, they don't like it and they spend more time like cleaning themselves off rather
yeah,
than feeding.
yeah,
So it helps with that. I think with the mixing with silicate, you're still going to get the benefits of the protective coating on the leaf, you might not get as much of the like contact efficacy on insect and fungal bodies, the like desiccation, just because the clay will be coating them instead, but it
Yeah.
should still be doing something.
I could see where they're additive because they both do the same thing, sort of coat the surface and keep them away. And the silicate does a few more things that the kaolin probably doesn't. So I could see it's always, if you can afford it, it's always better to have double mechanisms. People do that. They rotate insecticides. Like we get clients that'll use spinosad and then use like pyganic, like to rotate different, even though they're organic, organic chemistries. Just because one may work better against different insects and you're not going to get resistance that quickly, but people do that or add two things together. So I can't say for sure, but I wouldn't see a compatibility issue there. The other question was, does the copper work better with a sticker?
Quava, you don't need one because of that oil soluble tail. It essentially does the same thing that a sticker would. So it's sort of already like it's mixed with the surfactant just because of how the copper itself is formulated there. With other coppers, and really any product that I talked about today, other than the Quava, a spreader sticker is a good idea just because so many of them work as a contact product. And so the better coverage and contact you can get out of them, the better they'll work. So Quava's the one sort of odd exception just because it's already formulated to work like a surfactant does.
Yeah. Yeah, and the best sticker we found in the organic world, if you are looking for an organic, is New Film. It's NU/FILM. And for a spreader, the Yucca works really well as too. And Yucca also is a sticker, a natural sticker, not quite as strong as the New Film, which is basically like comes from tree sap. So Keith asked, does it have any effect on stomate activity? I would assume he's talking about the sil matrix. He just said it, so I'm not sure. So I guess we can answer that. Would the sil matrix have an effect on stomate activity?
I don't think that it does. It's just sort of adding that amorphous silicate to the outer leaf surface. It's not going to like clog up stomates.
Yep.
If you were asking about something else, feel free to clarify with us
Yeah.
which one you're asking about, and we'll try to get it answered.
Yeah, he just typed yes, sil matrix. So it was
Yeah.
back there when you were talking. I assume so. So because it's on the surface. So any more questions, you can put them through the Q&A. But it looks like that's it. So thank you, Carly. You did a great job, especially I know poor Lee had flu. We got an email this morning, so you kind of had to wing the second half of the slide, and you did great. And it's always a pleasure working with you guys in Certus. And we carry the trilogy, the home plate, which Carly didn't talk about. Great products. The Sueva, the trilogy, the neem oil. So we carry a bunch of their products, and they really do a great job with everything. So thanks, Carly.
Thanks again for having me.
Okay.